Hey everyone, I'm Chris Carter. This is the Locked On Steelers podcast, and it is finally Steelers training camp week. I'm going to go over the biggest talking points leading up to Wednesday when players report. We have a lot to break down here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. So let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show in your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Steelers fans, it is training camp week. Now, again, players report Wednesday. First practice is Thursday, and then it's going to take some time to get into padded practices. But now we are finally into the time where we can start actually looking at things that are coming up again. Now, there's still no news that's really happened. There was the Brandon Ayuk wants to be traded. Again, we're not going to address that much on the show. We've talked about that ad nauseum here. I don't need to talk about that anymore. But what we do need to talk about is getting you ready for the things that are going to be big happening in training camp all throughout the next month or so, because that's going to be the focus of this team. And there's a lot to work on to get them ready for day one when they go out there and they got to play the Atlanta Falcons for the opening game of the season. So all that being said, let's talk about some of the big things that are here. And we're going to hit on all positions leading up through the week. We're going to have on guests. We're hoping to have on Alan Saunders for tomorrow. Mike DeFay will be back. Now that he's off of vacation, we're going to get you all ready. And then when we get to training camp, we'll be giving you all the angles, videos, everything that we can get from there. But I still think, I know a lot of people are going to want to talk about the receiver situation and the slot cornerback situation, and we'll get to those. But I still think the biggest factor that must go well for the Steelers in this training camp situation, and yes, quarterback's up there too, all that. But the crux of what is supposed to make this team go from being a team that's really good on defense and bad on offense to being really good on defense to decent on offense is the strength of the offensive line and their ability to coalesce in the coming years. And if you've been listening to this show or watching the show, you know what I'm about to tell you. The Steelers offensive line did take steps forward last year because they showed in the first half of the season, they were struggling to get the run going. But when Broderick Jones became a starter at right tackle, they went from being one of the mediocre / bottom of the league rushing teams to being the second best rushing team in the NFL after Broderick Jones became a consistent starter in week 10. So now the question is this year, how does that offensive line take another step forward? And I'm going to specifically address the center position in the next segment. But right now, let's talk about the overall composition of this offensive line. Going into training camp, we are expecting the overall look to go to still have Dan Moore Jr. at left tackle, Isaac Seumalo at left guard, Herbig probably at center for the immediate start of camp, because that's just how they do with the whole, rookies got to earn their way in. And then James Daniels at right guard, and then Broderick Jones at right tackle. But that does not mean that that's what's going to be that's going to be how everything lines up going into week one, or that they can't make a change in the middle of the season like they did last year, putting in Broderick Jones and him giving a huge boost to the offensive line. Of course, everyone is going to have their eyes on Troy Fautanu, the first-round draft pick rookie that everyone's been really excited to see get to work. And the question will be, how does this group come together and show that early on in training camp? I'm going to remind you something that I remind everyone every year that everyone always forgets. Take every practice like a grain of sand or a grain of salt. Just one little bit of time, add it up at the end. Do not overvalue one practice versus 20 practices, because it's a training camp is a long process where there's several weeks, there's several breakdowns. You'll see highlights, you'll hear takes and views and all this stuff. Pile it up. There's 7 shots where every day they're going to go and try. The offense is trying to score 7 straight times from 2 yards out. The defense is going to try to stop them. There's going to be good offensive days, good defensive days, and everyone's going to have noise about who they think's doing what. But the goal is through this, and not just the training camp, but also the preseason. What do we see when we stack things up? And sometimes what you even see when you stack those things up don't always add up to being everything. I mean, everyone thought, Kenny Pickett and the offense was taking steps forward because they looked so good in the preseason last year. And then we saw that was not the case when the season actually started. But you can still want to see the building blocks put in place for this offensive line to take real steps forward. And I think a huge part of this needs to involve, one, Broderick Jones being much sharper this year. I think it's going to be really interesting to see. The Steelers have a really strong group of edge rushers: TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Nate Herbig. I'm going to mess those guys up all season long, aren't I? But they're going to have those guys coming off the edge, being able to play. Nick Herbig's the edge rusher, but they're going to have those guys coming off the edge, and I'm going to be very interested to see how does Broderick Jones do against those guys consistently every day, because he is going to get tested this year. Last year he was the rookie, and they were kind of feeling out how is he doing. This year is going to be all about setting the tone. But I remind you also, a big part of this is you're not going to see these guys they're not going to be the talk of the town in the first few days of training camp, because they got to get acclimated to training camp. They got to come in, they got to do their non-padded practices. So you're not going to see these guys hit. But what you do want to see is you want to see Broderick Jones taking command, taking the lead, and stepping up in practice and being in the right spots and doing the right fundamentals and hearing the right things from him when he talks at training camp. Because when he does those things, I think that's a sign that he's stepping into the role that the Steelers want for him. Remember, he's still a very young player. Like when you go and you look at Broderick Jones and him, the Steelers drafted him young because that's, again, something that you want to do. He's 23 this year. This is going to be a chance to see, okay, how much did he mature from last year, and how much is he ready to step into being the face of the offensive line moving forward? And then also, how well does Troy Fautanu step into things? Does Dan Moore Jr. just relent and just give up his spot? I don't think he will, and he's actually one of the more experienced guys on this offense. When you think about who has the most starts of any player in this offense, he's right up there. So I don't think it's a given that you're going to see Troy Fautanu out there right away, or Broderick Jones moved to left, unless Dan Moore Jr. all of a sudden is good at right tackle. What we've heard from Mike Tomlin himself, but in past seasons, that he's not. And that's something we've discussed with Jim Wexell of Steel City Insider on this very show before. Mike Tomlin said that. Now this year he's denied that. He's tried to cover that up, because I think that the Steelers don't want to lock themselves into anything on the offensive line. But the bottom line is, we're going to see these guys test things out. And I continue to urge people, don't come out in the first day and say, oh man, Dan Moore Jr. is still at left tackle. This is going to be terrible. He may not be at left tackle for that long. He may not make it through all the training camp. They might move him to right. They might move to the left. Troy Fautanu might step up. It's all part of the process. They're going to want to test Fautanu. They're going to want to test Jones on both sides of the ball, right and left. And then we're going to get to see how this group also comes together, because it's also just, you have to remember, a big part of this isn't just how this offensive line works individually, like how Broderick Jones block. It's how they work together. It's how they communicate. It's how they chip together when they go from double teaming one of the defensive tackles and getting to the second level to get a linebacker. It's how they communicate when a team sends an overload blitz, and how they try to cut it off to give the quarterback as much time as possible and communicate so that the pocket doesn't crumble when they're under assault. All those things are going to be huge. And if Broderick Jones and the younger players like Troy Fautanu and those guys can show that they're part of a cohesive unit, that could go a long way for this offense. But a lot of it does come down to the center position. And I want to take a caller's question about Zach Frazier and Nate Herbig, because that's a big talking point for this season and how things will play out. We'll get to that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, we'll remind you, this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. I love sports, and I love them so much that I never want them to stop. And guess what? You don't have to worry about it, because they are ongoing all the time. When you go to FanDuel Sportsbook, you can take advantage of all the action that's still going on in all the sports, whether it's Major League Baseball, the WNBA, big fights that are going on, tennis action, the Olympics are coming up. There's so much that you could bet on the app. Just open the app on your phone by going and looking up FanDuel in the App Store, or you can go and go to FanDuel.com today. And right now, all customers, not just new customers, not just existing customers, but all customers get a boost or a bonus every single day all summer long. That's right. There's something for everyone all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and you can start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is an official sportsbook betting partner of Major League Baseball. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our getting ready for training camp, as this is now the first week of training camp as the Steelers report to St. Vincent College for training camp on Wednesday. Let's get into some calls here that I think were very relevant to some of the things we wanted to discuss. First one is about the offensive line. Again, if you ever want to call into the show, it's 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, keep your question under a minute. We'll try to get you on the show. This question revolves around the center position. It was very timely, so I wanted to get into this. Patrick from Maryland, take it away.
Hey, Chris, this is Patrick from Maryland. My question is about the center position. We heard about it all off season because it was a position of need. We need to sign a center, need to draft a center. We go and draft our guy, and then he was never heard from again. And I know the consensus is around this time of the year, they're just out there playing patty cake with each other until the pads come on and we can really find out what's what. But we've heard about Broderick Jones, Fautanu, Dan Moore Jr., and how they're progressing, who may or may not start, and the whole 9 yards. What about Zach Frazier and Nick Herbig? Are they developing? Are they improving? Who could potentially start? How well are they looking so far at the center position? It's going to be predicated on how our offense is able to complete all the hopes and expectations we have for them this year. And I just need to know what's going on. So let me know if you have any information on that. Love the show. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate you calling into the Locked On Steelers podcast. Again, as always, if you want to call in like Patrick did, 412-223-6644. Leave your name, leave your name, where you're from. Keep your question under a minute. We'll get you on the show here. So, Patrick, let's address a few things here. First, we have heard from Zach Frazier. In fact, we've had clips of him on this very show after we've spoken to him both after rookie camp and OTAs. I think I missed him during mini camp because I'd already spoke to him really 3 times because we also spoke to him at the combine. But point being, I do hear you. There hasn't been as much talk about Zach Frazier during the OTAs minicamp period, particularly because he wasn't the starting center for the first team offense during those periods. Now, it's also an important reminder that doesn't usually matter. They're just usually letting him get acclimated to things, and they're letting Nate Herbig kind of take the role now because he's the veteran offensive lineman. But I hear you that you haven't heard that much. But I'll tell you things that I've heard from Zach Frazier. I've heard from Zach Frazier that he's been doing well. He's been learning things quickly. He's been sitting with Broderick Jones a lot, who's been helping him get through film sessions as they're kind of studying the offense, learning things. I think we're starting to see a lot of things develop as far as how leadership could work in the offense. And a lot of it's going to, I think that's something else to watch in these early days of training camp, who become the leading voices of this offense and for the different units. Because as you know, wide receiver, George Pickens is most talented of that group right now, but is he the voice? Is he the leader? We haven't seen that from him yet. He's been more so the young upstart who can make a lot of really big plays, but hasn't been the guy that galvanizes everyone around him. Russell Wilson, we've seen him be a leader before. I think it's something we've addressed a lot on this show. On the offensive line, Isaac Seumalo, I feel like is the default leader or the de facto leader for the offensive line, but I think the Steelers want to see guys like Broderick Jones step up and into those roles and be part of that movement there. Pat Frymuth, I think, is a leader. Najee Harris, I think, is a leader. Those are all guys that I think set the right tones for the team. But the big question for me when you talk about that center position, you haven't seen the physicality. I think Zach Frazier, we talked about communication, right? We talked about how the offensive line needs to coalesce. It needs to be in sync. Zach Frazier's in the middle, literally, of all of that, and also figuratively, because when you look at what has to happen, the Steelers need the center position to be strong again. If you think back to the best years of the Steelers, most of the times there's a great center or a very good center in the middle of it. The one year that wasn't the case, or I guess the 2 years were the late 2000s when in 2008 they had a center, and then that they were able to win a Super Bowl that year. But when they won in 2005, it was with Jeff Harding. When they made the Super Bowl 30 in the 90s, it was with Dermontti Dawson. Some say he's the greatest center of all time. And of course, in the 70s, you had Ray Mansfield, and then eventually the guy that some people also say is the greatest center of all time, Mike Webster. And then, by the way, in the 2010s, when they made their most recent Super Bowl, Maurkice Pouncey came along. So the center has been a very important position in the history of the Steelers. And so Zach Frazier does bear a very important role here, in that if he can provide even just stability to the position, even if he's not a superstar center, if he can just be stable there, that will be a huge upgrade. Because people forget when the Steelers were looking at last season, and they looked at how their roster was constructed, and everyone was looking at how they were going to try to use the offense. A big part of it was they were hoping to get better performance from the center position with Mason Cole. And a big part of that was because in 2022, Mason Cole looked really good because he was just not Kendrick Green, and Kendrick Green was just awfully bad the year before. And then in 2023, you kind of saw Mason Cole kind of was what he was, and that was just it. Zach Frazier needs to be able to take that step forward. And you're right. Watching patty cake isn't going to solve it. Zach Frazier's big thing that I love about his tape, and I think that will be very, very intriguing to see in training camp. And it's why one of my favorite things this training camp is going to be to see the big guys work. I'm going to love to see Zach Frazier versus Keanu Benton a lot of times in this training camp. I want to see how he gets guys out of the hole. Zach Frazier was a known wrestler. That's where he got a lot of his fundamentals and some of the background of his football skills. He is, when you look at him on tape, he is great. And if you line up somebody right in A gap, right on the nose of him, and he gets their hands on him, he moves them out of the way. And that's something the Steelers haven't had as a mauler who can get rid of guys in A gap like that. Even when Maurkice Pouncey was around, Pouncey was not a guy like he would do well. He'd do well against the average defensive lineman. But when a stalwart defensive tackle lined up over top of him, like a Fletcher Cox or an Aaron Donald, Pouncey needed help. You go back to the Brandon Williams days of the Ravens and look up some of those games, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But if Zach Frazier can be that guy, I feel you on what your concerns are, Patrick. But if he does what we've seen him do at West Virginia, I think that Zach Frazier could be something truly special. And I think if he does just that and keeps the communication online and coalesces with the line, that does so much for this team. It solves some of the A-gap problems they've had. It makes the running up the middle a more viable thing, because that's another part of this, is that Najee Harris is not a run to the sideline type of runner. He is more of a get north, get south type of guy, but he's had to kind of adapt to that because the Steelers offensive line just hasn't been good most of his time with the Steelers. And he's also a guy that's usually about falling forward, running up the middle, breaking tackles, being able to use that momentum to create things. But the Steelers haven't been able to dominate the middle because their center position has been weak. And that's even with Mason Cole being in there. And again, Mason Cole did an admirable job holding down the position, rising the standard from what it was with Kendrick Green, and at least providing some viable help there. But now Zach Frazier was drafted in the second round to be something to be something more. And he's not going to be the best version of himself you're going to see this year. But if he can just be the guy that gets the guy out of A gap, doesn't mess up the snap, and keeps everyone and is learning and make sure that he keeps everyone in line, that goes so much to what the offense actually needs. And I do think that you'll see him take over sooner rather than later. I know Herbig is the guy there that kind of has the spot, but I do anticipate that Herbig will be kind of a name-only guy that you see for maybe the first week or two, maybe the first week of pads. And then I think maybe by after the first preseason game, then you see Zach Frazier take over as the number one center in the first team offense, because then he'll have learned more of the offense. He'll had some experience, had some pads on. They'll probably have played another opponent. The Steelers are also, I believe they're doing an inner team practice with the Lions in this time. So that's when I think that Zach Frazier will get to show what he really has. But I would not worry, Patrick, about the not hearing of him there. He's a center. He's an offensive lineman. They don't get all the talk. And we talked to him plenty, during rookie camp and OTAs before mini camp. don't worry. I think that him not having seen too much of him talk isn't a bad thing. I think that he's in a really good position, and he's going to be an important part for this offense. And if he is an important and a good part of this offense, I do think it ends up going a long way to making the Steelers offense that much better. But I want to take a step back and address another question. And this is more so of the market value of different positions in the NFL. We've talked a little about training camp coming up. I want to take another question here. We'll do that next on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, we'll remind you this show is also brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools that help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. We're back here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Again, it's training camp week, so we'll address more of the topics there. But again, as always, we get calls that I think are sometimes really interesting in the topics that come up. Again, you can call in with your topic at 412-223-6644. This call is more so about the market of how positions are going. Take it away, Gary from Danville, Virginia.
Hey, Chris, what's up? This is Garen from Danville, Virginia. I watch your show every day, every morning. You do a great job. My question is, I know that you said that you wasn't going to stop talking about the Brandon Ayuk trade for right now. But my question is, why would the Steelers really trade for Brandon Ayuk? My thing of it is, if you trade for Brandon Ayuk, that'll take receptions or passes away from George Pickens, which, in my opinion, I could believe this season he will come into a top 10 receiver. And another thing, do you believe that the wide receiver position is becoming like the running back position? Because every year, every draft season is wide out, after wide out, after wide out, first, second, or third round. I just want to know your thoughts on that. Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate your work. You have a good day.
Thank you, Gary. We appreciate your question here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. And as always, it's 412-223-6644 to leave your name, question, and let us know where you're from. We'll try to get your question on the show. I also want to thank everyone for their support in calling in. It's always very awesome to hear when people enjoy the show and want their questions on the air, because it means you listen to the show or you watch the show. So we appreciate you all. But so let's address a few things here, Gary. First, I do hear what you're saying about the market of positions and how things, as far as the value of keeping guys. I will say this: I don't think that wide receivers fall into the part where it is like running backs in the market, because overall, like, there's just always wide receivers getting picked. Like, even just this year, there were 3 wide receivers picked in the top 10. I don't think there's been 2 running backs picked in the top 10 in years. And I'm trying to scroll through to see if there has been one recently. I actually don't think there has been in quite some time. It's even rare to get one running back in the top 10, though we did get one last year with Bijan Robinson. But point about that, I think wide receivers still valued much higher. However, to your point where I think you're getting at here, wide receivers are very replaceable. And I think that is where things are very true to your point, Gary. And this is where I feel you on the George Pickens thing, because I think George Pickens has the potential to be not just a number 1 wide receiver, but an ace of a number 1 wide receiver to lead a core. And typically in today's NFL, you look around the league, for the most part, teams that have the roster makeup and they're trying to become really competitive, they pay major bucks to one wide receiver, they pay like minor bucks to another, unless they, there's rare situations where they have like franchise tags, they are paying two wide receivers big money. But most of the league has one big receiver with big money, another receiver with like decent money, and then guys on rookie deals, cheap veterans after that, because they got to spread the money out throughout the rest of the team. And that could be the model the Steelers are headed to with George Pickens. But to your point about the replaceability of wide receiver, because everyone wants to get Brandon Ayuk. And if you follow this show, you listen to the show, you watch the show, I've been on the train of I don't think it would be smart to do so unless it really, really works for the Steelers. And when I mean really, really work for the Steelers, I mean they give up very little draft capital and he doesn't end up having to cost them $30 million in cap space, which I don't think either are going to happen at this point. But again, getting back to the thing here is, why would you do that when next year, if you really wanted a wide receiver, you can go draft one in the early parts of the round, they could be a super playmaker type wide receiver. Again, the excitement this year for all the receivers the Steelers could have taken, not that they could have taken these guys, but Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, Roma Dunze, all three of those guys went top 10, but even Brian Thomas, the guy of LSU that went 23rd to the Jaguars, Xavier Worthy, who made a really impressive play in Chiefs training camp this past weekend. The Niners going and get Ricky Pearsall, all those type of guys, Xavier Legette, who's with the Panthers, all those types of guys, you can get those guys in the early rounds. And then there's still the other guys like Adonai Mitchell, who went in the middle of the second round, right after the Steelers pick, that there's a lot of excitement for. You can reload at wide receiver much easier than most positions because every year there's just new star talent coming out at the position. So that's another reason why I'm not in the Brandon Ayuk trade bid, is because I think this team can live with George Pickens, Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson, Van Jefferson, whoever all else is that wide receiver this season, and then they can go get another young wide receiver next year. And I think that is the move the Steelers should try to do, because there will be big name receivers in pretty much every draft for the next several years, because wide receiver is just a talented position where there's always athletes, and it's very tough to find bad wide receiver classes, unless they ultimately don't work out in the long run. But I mean, you look at the past several, again, 3 guys taken in the top 10 this past year, 2 guys were taken in the top 10 the year before that, 4 were in the top 12 and last year. The year before that, in 2021, 3 were in the top 10 again. They're going to happen. Again, that's just the top picks. We're not even talking about the guys that come in the middle part that turn out to be really good. So to your point, no, wide receiver is a running back, because running backs, ultimately still aren't valued as high as wide receivers. But the market is becoming harder for wide receivers who are veterans to make their money if they're not superstar number one wide receivers, because then they'll get paid, but they won't get paid super much. Look at what Tyler Boyd's doing right now in the contract that he signed. He was hoping that he was, once a guy that was thought maybe he could develop into a number one, and he never really did in the NFL, but he was always a solid guy. But, then the Bengals, they couldn't afford to keep paying him. Now then he had to hit free agency. So I look at this situation right now, and I think it's more so about not paying those guys, not paying the lesser than superstar number one wide receivers. That's going to become the trend that you see with how the NFL values the wide receiver position. But running back, ultimately, if you're not a superstar running back at all, you're just not even getting the money. Even if you are a superstar, we look what happened with Saquon Barkley, and you can see the Hard Knocks episode of how the Giants thing went. With his departure, running back, it's even harder to be a star. So I think that's going to be a big question moving forward, is how does the wide receiver market handle having all these new talents all the time, and how does that impact, guys that are older, guys that are looking for those jobs. All those things could play into the factor as far as roster construction, which is why I took that question. And I think it's going to be important to monitor to see how things continue to go at the wide receiver position across the league, who keeps getting contracts, what kind of players get contracts. And if there's a trend that's kind of noticeable about who makes the most money and what kind of play, what's the biggest factor of players that gets them those contracts at wide receiver. So again, not at running back, but definitely there is an uncomfortable spot to be in if you're a wide receiver in the NFL who's not on their rookie contract anymore. And I think that's where it could get really interesting for a lot of things moving forward. So thank you to your questions, both Gary and Patrick. Hey, we had one guy from Maryland, another guy from Virginia. Look at the Southern Steelers fans calling into the Locked On Steelers podcast. Thanks again for tuning into today's show. We'll keep you going with other topics about this week. We will be getting into George Pickens and Joey Porter Jr. because that was a big topic in last year's training camp. We'll get into a lot of other major training camp talking points all throughout the week, including when we go to training camp, and you will see clips from players in training camp on this show. So do stay tuned with that. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com. Find me here in the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, breaking down your Pittsburgh Steelers. See you here again tomorrow, right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.